Lesson 2.6, we'll talk about Jews and Hellenism. Hellenism is based on the Greek gods, on beauty, on Greek mythology, on paganism, on idolatry, and of course the Jews object to that. The Jews are against idols. We believe in God, which is an undefined God, which doesn't have a physical character, and the Greeks have always been perturbed why the Jews don't accept them. Of course, we only believe in one God. We don't believe in Zeus. We don't believe in Athena. We don't believe in a God of nature. In Jewish tradition, we relate to these issues, and we relate to the Greeks in believing in these things, but it's more a point of contention and a polemic. Jews reject Greek aestheticism. We don't idealize a beautiful body or a muscular, athletic body as a virtue. And again, the Jews were never part of the Greek state, of the city-states. We resided there as merchants, but we weren't part of it. We weren't taxpayers, and we weren't slaves. We were in any identity that we say in Hebrew falls between the cracks. We were urban dwellers who were merchants and had connections all throughout Asia Minor in the Greek Hellenistic world. The Jews were intelligent people. They aroused the curiosity of a philosopher like Aristotle. So there was Clearchus of Soli, who related to the encounter of Aristotle and a Jew. He conversed with us and with other philosophical persons and made a trial of our skill in philosophy. And as he lived with many learned men, he communicated more information than he received from us. The impact on the Greek alphabet probably needs the least elaboration. After all, its very name is derived from the Hebrew word letters aleph bet. Even in the letters of the alphabet itself, there are remnants of its origins. For example, the letter Q, which in the Greek and the Latin alphabets is a redundant letter and useless on its own, can be traced to the Semitic guttural kuf. So the Jews revered Alexander the Great. We have this midrash, this legend that when Alexander the Great was approaching Jerusalem, he saw a Jewish intelligent elder, and he asked him, "How am I going to take over India?" And the Jew gave him some advice. This is obviously fiction, but it's a legend in both cultures. Many Jews name their children Alexander, but he was a Hellenist who actually wanted to Hellenize us. He wanted us to believe in this glorious Greek culture of mythology and gods and idols. We objected to it, but there's a certain trait in Jewish culture that we revere or respect the hegemonic dominant culture and leaders. And so because of this reverence that the Jews have toward the sovereign, they are respected. We have some exemplary figures like the Einsteins, et cetera, or Rambam, and so we're revered by a lot of these cultures, and in turn we revere these cultures, even though we combat a lot of their traits. So the Sfaradim, particular Rambam, were influenced by Greek philosophy, by Aristotle, and Aristotelian Syrian philosophy. It also is part of a Kabbalistic analysis. This is our tradition, but the Rambam, in one hand, was much more liberal and tolerant. In many ways, he was very staunchly conservative, and you could even say reactionary. But he is part of the Sephardic tradition of law, but also tolerance, and also being open to other ways of thought. A Salonican 16th century Rabbi Moshe Almoznino, who also invented an astrolabe, a mathematical instrument for navigation and calculation. He also translated Aristotle's Ethics into Judeo-Spanish. In the Ashkenazi world, that wouldn't have never happened. That was a modern secular trait, but in Sephardic tradition since Spain, that was integrated into religious thought. Now, there are Jews who are what are called Philo-Hellenists. They're friends of Greek culture. So there were, even though terrible things happened in the Greek Revolution, there were Jews who volunteered to fight for Greece to get its independence and for Greece to be recreated as a democratic, enlightened republic or country. Now, the Jews also fought, many of them were foreigners, for Greece in various wars. For example, in 1897, in one of the wars against the Ottoman Empire, there was a Marco Baruch, a Sephardic young man from Bulgaria, who fought for Greece for the ideals of a modern, progressive, nationalist country, and he fell. And so he became sort of like a minor folk hero of those who know about him. Then I mentioned before, the Greek Jewish communities were destroyed in the Greek Revolution. 11 communities were destroyed because they lived with the Turks, they fought with the Turks, or they were on the side of the Turks. They supplied the armies of the Turks. They were always viewed by the Greek insurgents and the Greek Orthodox as the devil, as someone who's together with the Turks who we don't want. Now, there's a paradox here, because the Greek Orthodox were actually the main minority revered religious group under the Ottomans. Okay? And they weren't backward. They were the most progressive and the most talented, and they benefited the most from the Ottoman culture. But those, when people were in the late 18th century, 19th century, when these romanticists wanted to create their own countries, to play out, to act out their own cultures, so they rebelled against the Ottoman Empire. But the Jews defended the Ottoman Empire. When the Jews were under Venice, they defended Venice and opposed the Ottomans who attacked. But when the Ottomans were already established and the Jews did well in this system that gave the Jews autonomy and religious freedom, the Jews defended the Ottomans. So the Greeks are going to really be angered by the fact that the Jews don't want to be part of the Greek Revolution. This continues. Even in 1909, there were 10 merchants from Yanina whose ears were cut off because the Jews didn't want to be part of the Greek revolutionary movement, and the ears were put in a letter and said to the Jews, this is what's going to happen if you continue resisting joining our struggle. And the Jews continued resisting the struggle. This didn't deter them, but these are the tensions. But on the other hand, the Jews in the west of Greece, in the Ionian Islands, they were originally part of Venice, and then they were part of a harsh British colonial rule. The Jews had to do forced labor in road work. So the Jews in 1864 looked forward to Greek rule. For them, it made life much better. But then there were tensions. Wherever there were too many Jews, the Jews were politically threatening to the population. So in local politics in Corfu, where the Jews had previously had 2 mayors, they were like a thorn in the urban society, and there were large-scale blood libels in 1891. So I call the relationship between the Jews and the Greeks harmony and disharmony. It works both ways. It works well in terms of influences. You can't have knowledge and you can't excel without 2 pillars, Athens and Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a Jewish tradition, and Athens is Greek knowledge and democracy, and both of those go hand in hand. In reality, in modern history, it doesn't play out like that, but as ideals and in education, these are 2 poles. In 1881, the Jews welcomed Greek rule in Thessaly, in communities like Trikala, Volos, Arta, etc., but the Greeks always had a sense of revenge toward the Jews. because the Jews resisting Greek nationalism, because of the theological divide, because the Jews didn't accept Christianity, they didn't accept Christ as the Messiah. The Greek Orthodox and the Christians accused the Jews of killing Judas, of blood libels, and so blood libels continued. So even though the Jews were devout citizens under Greece, in Thessaly, for example, or in Athens, there were blood libels against them. In Athens, there were blood libels against the Jews in 1847. In Thessaly, there were blood libels against the Jews in 1893. This is 12 years after the Jews had cordially accepted Greek sovereignty. In 1912, when Greece conquered the northern parts of Macedonia, like Salonika, they entered the city, and there were riots. The soldiers pillaged the city. They killed Jews. They destroyed synagogues. They took Torah scrolls and they dragged them into the streets. But then you have the Jews of the southern part of Greece wanted a modus vivendi, and it was agreed that under Greek rule, the Jews would only have to go to the army after 3 years. And then in the continuum, the Jews were devout soldiers. In the Albanian campaign, when Italy threatened Greece of attack on October 28th, 1940, the Greek dictator Metaxas said, "Ochi," no. He wouldn't give in to the Italian demands. And the Jews were about a fourth of the fighting force of the Greek army. And at first, we pushed back the Italians into Albania. They attacked from the northwest corner of Greece. And there was one of the architects of pushing back the Italians was a colonel called Mordechai Frazis, and he fell in battle leading his brigade on the 5th of December 1940, and he became a national hero in Greece, and there are monuments for him. And the Jews fought valiantly. In the end, the Nazis took over on the Italian front and the Bulgarian front, but the Jews were also fought for Greece. They also fought for Greece and an independent Greece in the German occupation on the side of the leftist Greek communist Elas Hayam movement, and the Jews were accepted in the movement, and they were active in a lot of battles. And Jews who escaped various communities could have refuge in the partisan stronghold, and those people were protected. Thousands of Jews were protected, for example, in the Pelion Mountains outside of Volos. The Jews were conservative. Even socialists voted for the royalists, for the monarchy. And the Greeks wanted a republic. They wanted a Western European republic. But that goes against a free economy that the Jews had under the Ottoman Empire. So the free capitalists or the Zionists or the socialists were all against a Greek republic. The head of the Greek republic, his name was Venizelos. So he was very popular in Greece. But he realized that he had to push the Jews out of the picture electorally. So he created a separate Jewish electoral college for the Jews and the Muslims in Macedonia and Thrace, so they wouldn't vote against him, and this way he could sway the national elections. So for 5 candidacies in the parliament, the Jews had their own parliamentary members, and they could vote for them. They had 5 even. Okay, but this was a point of contempt, of tension. And then in the 1917 fire in Salonika, where 72,000 residents were made refugees, half the city was burned down, 55,000 Jews were refugees. And they didn't get their property back. And they were duped by Venizelos. Venizelos, he was the one that led Greece into war to recreate the Byzantine Empire, what's called the Megali Ide, the great idea. And he attacked Turkey and the Ottoman Empire. In Greece ruled the Ottoman Empire and parts of eastern Thrace for 3 years. The Jews also fought valiantly on his side against the Turks. Okay, But in the end, they lost. The Greeks lost. They had to retreat. But the agreement was that there would be a population exchange. Over 1 million Greek Orthodox, Greek-speaking Greeks who never lived in Greece would be resettled in Greece. Then 1 million Muslim Ottoman Turkish or Turkish-speaking Turks who lived in Greece or the Greek peninsula would be transferred to Turkey. So each population, Greece and Turkey, would be left with 100,000 as a minority. So 100,000 Muslims still live in Thrace in Greece, and 100,000 Greeks still live in Istanbul and in Turkey. But what happened was that a hostile Greek Orthodox population from Asia Minor came to Greece, and in particular to Thessaloniki, and it changed the demography of the city. The Jews were a majority until 1922, and then they become a fourth of the population. But this population had instigated over 50 blood libels toward the Jews in the 19th and early 20th century. So they wanted to really ruin Salonican Jewry. So they changed the whole dynamic. The Jews were no longer in charge of the port as port workers or customs workers. It became a Greek port. Okay, and locally, the Greek Orthodox and the refugees and Ponts, a different group, they instigated against the Jews in a daily newspaper called Macedonia, the Macedonian newspaper. And an editor of the newspaper Macedonia named Pharthis accused the Jews of being traitors to Greece. They accused a Jewish boy who was a Maccabi head in Salonika of going to Bulgaria for a Bulgarian nationalist meeting. He went to Bulgaria for a Maccabi regional meeting, but the newspaper accused Yitzhak Cohen of going for a political meeting of the youth wing of a Bulgarian Macedonian nationalist movement who wanted to take over Macedonia and make it Bulgaria. Okay, so there were riots against the Jews in half of Salonika in 1931 in June, and a neighborhood called Campbell of Jewish port workers and fishermen were burned to the ground. Okay, so Venizelos and his movement are part of this, and they accuse the Jews in parliament of being traitors to Greece. So the Jews always supported the monarchy in the elections, as opposed to the Venizelists, who were the Republicans, who believed in a Western European government. You see all the paradoxes. So a fourth of Salonika are Jewish socialists. They're not accepted by the Greek socialists. And there were Jewish socialists and communists in parliament, but they're looked at by a lot of the mainstream society as traitors. So you have in all these issues a lot of the tensions. So because now most of Salonika are Christians who hated the Jews, they brought this hate from Asia Minor. During the Holocaust, the local Greeks in Salonika aren't going to save the Jews. There are only 2 families who were rescued or could hide in Salonika, whereas the Greek people, including the partisans, especially on the left, accepted the Jews, and if they went to the partisans, to the mountains, they could be accepted and live there and fight and be a part of the resistance. But the rightist movement, here's the paradox, the Jews were royalists. But Metaxas, the dictator, who was very pro-Zionist, in his youth movement, they wouldn't accept Jews. And in the rightist partisan movement called Edes, they wouldn't accept Jews. A few were there in the beginning, but they had anti-Semitic traits. So you have all these, paradoxes and contradictions. But the Jews in general, at this point, were very pro-Greek. In terms of Jews in Hellenism, 700,000 Greeks, a tenth of the people, died in the German occupation fighting against Nazism, including the Jews. So in most of the situations, the Greek society protested the deportation of the Jews to Auschwitz and what the Nazis were doing. But there were elements like these Asia Minor refugees in Salonika who opposed the Jews. Whereas in the south of Greece, many Jews were protected in villages, in mountains, in monasteries by the Catholic Church, by the Greek Orthodox Church, and in illegal immigration to Palestine. The Greek Orthodox Church helped. El Asayam helped. The Histadrut from Palestine had cooperation with El Asayam. And so the Histadrut would send pharmaceutical items, they'd send boots, army boots for the Greek resistance, and the Greek resistance helped Jews get out of Greece via the Evia Peninsula to Turkey on little fishing boats. So you have all these paradoxes. So it's the harmony and disharmony. And then in the south of Greece, they have maybe 40,000 people who actually helped the Jews survive. And there should be many more righteous Gentiles, but there are only a few hundred.